We are the storm, and our enemies cannot comprehend our strength. You have no idea the dragon you have awakened. Well, let's dive right into this explainer because those are some chilling words. Stephen Miller delivered that speech on September 21st, 2025, and the documentary Fault Lines points out a really stark context here. Exactly as Miller was giving this speech, literally framing a battle to save civilization, he was simultaneously overseeing militarized enforcement units deploying right into American cities. It's an opening that immediately sets the tone for the massive scale of domestic operations we're about to unpack.
Today, we're unpacking Al Jazeera's Fault Lines documentary. We want to objectively examine the rise and the immense unelected power of Stephen Miller. The source material actually refers to him as the architect of the administration's sweeping immigration agenda. So in this explainer, we're going to trace the factual timeline. We'll look at how a former press aide became one of the most powerful unelected figures in modern American history, and precisely how his policies reshaped the landscape of the country.
The documentary grounds us right away in the extreme stakes of this agenda with a very specific number: 200. The film points out that just 2 days before Miller gave that dragon speech, he was involved in directing a military strike on a small boat in the Caribbean Sea. That strike was the third of over 60 similar strikes, which ultimately resulted in over 200 deaths. The source highlights this to really illustrate how the administration started using military power to enforce its border policies, massively escalating the traditional approach.
And to put the domestic impact into perspective, consider this. While those military strikes were happening at sea, 2,000 National Guard troops were being deployed simultaneously to Washington, D.C. According to the documentary, they were sent to counter American citizens who had gathered to protest these exact immigration policies. Miller's public response? He basically dismissed the protesters entirely and asserted that the administration was just protecting the Capitol. This juxtaposition, overseas military strikes happening alongside massive domestic troop deployments, it paints a vividly clear picture of the atmosphere at the time.
Section 1. Origins of an Ideology. From Santa Monica to the White House. To understand how we arrived at these staggering numbers and military-style deployments, the film flashes back to explore where this ideology actually started.
The documentary traces his roots back to Santa Monica, California, which is, ironically, one of the wealthiest and most progressively liberal cities in the United States. Interviews with his classmates from middle and high school reveal that Miller actively leaned into this persona of white male grievance. He was extremely pro-war, intensely focused on things like weapons of mass destruction, and he actively clashed with the city's liberal demographics. Understanding this early posture, positioning himself as a persecuted minority voice fighting against a progressive stronghold, is absolutely crucial to making sense of the aggressive us versus them policies he would champion later on.
The stepping stones to his power are honestly fascinating. As a teenager, he called into the conservative Larry Elder Show a staggering 69 times just to complain about his high school. But that persistence caught the attention of far-right campus activist David Horowitz, who essentially took Miller under his wing. From there, Miller became a key aide to Senator Jeff Sessions in the 2010s, where he was instrumental in blocking comprehensive immigration reform. That experience totally set the stage for 2016, when he joined the Trump campaign as a speechwriter and essentially engineered hardline immigration as the campaign's absolute signature issue. By the time we hit 2025, the documentary notes he had returned to the White House as Deputy Chief of Staff, but this time he was entirely unrestrained by Congress or traditional political norms.
Section 2. Engineering the Crackdown. Unrestrained Power in the Second Administration. Let's look at exactly how that unrestrained power actually functioned. The documentary sets up a stark contrast between two radically different approaches to homeland security. Under the Obama-era policy, enforcement focused heavily on targeted priorities. They specifically went after known criminals, gang members, and security threats, mostly keeping arrests within 120 miles of the border. But under Stephen Miller's mandate, those priority categories were completely eliminated. Instead, he authorized massive interior sweeps across the entire country. This meant every single undocumented person became an equal target. By removing those targeted priorities, Miller effectively turned the whole United States into an active enforcement zone.
And this structural shift led directly to some incredibly aggressive metrics. Frustrated with the pace of deportations, the film reports that Stephen Miller completely bypassed traditional chains of command. He started personally calling Border Patrol agents directly and set an unprecedented quota of 3,000 arrests per day. I mean, how do you even hit a number that high? Well, agents had to completely alter their tactics.
To meet those massive quotas, the administration launched Operation Metro Surge. This essentially transformed immigration enforcement into an internal security force. They deployed over 3,000 federal officers deep into major U.S. cities, places like Chicago, L.A., and Minneapolis.
The documentary even includes audio of a senior Border Patrol officer in Los Angeles explicitly ordering agents to aggressively detain anyone who made physical contact with them. The source states this mandate resulted in brazen civil rights violations in the streets. People were forced down and pepper sprayed right in their cars. Ultimately, according to Washington Post data cited in the film, these sweeping operations led to a staggering 146,000 immigrants being arrested with absolutely zero criminal charges against them.
Unsurprisingly, intense operations like this sparked massive pushback. Hundreds of American citizens began protesting ICE and Border Patrol in their own cities. But Miller didn't de-escalate. Instead, he went on national television and actively applied the label of domestic terrorism to the American citizens protesting these sweeps. In that same broadcast, he spoke directly to ICE officers, publicly granting them federal immunity in their duties. The source really highlights how this rhetoric essentially gave agents a license to operate almost like a military force against domestic opposition.
Section 3. Backlash and Accountability. The climax in Minneapolis. This militarized approach and aggressive rhetoric inevitably reached a tragic boiling point.
The documentary explicitly tracks a really harrowing chain of events here. On January 7, 2026, an ICE officer in Minneapolis shot and killed a 37-year-old mother of 3 named Renee Good. Just over 2 weeks later, Border Patrol agents shot and killed a 37-year-old nurse, Alex Prey, who was filming them. Days later, overwhelming protests completely flooded the streets of Minneapolis. To many residents, it literally felt like an American city was under attack by the federal government. The source notes that the deaths of 2 native-born Americans by federal agents triggered such overwhelming public backlash that Congress finally stepped in. They withheld DHS funding, which triggered the longest shutdown in the department's history.
So what happens next? Accountability rolled out, but it was highly selective. The documentary frames it as a shield of loyalty. The congressional pressure and public outrage forced a massive shakeup. The DHS secretary was ousted, the Border Patrol commander was demoted, but the man who designed the policy, set the quotas, and escalated the rhetoric, the documentary points out that Stephen Miller remained entirely shielded by presidential loyalty. When a House committee called him to testify about the abuses, he completely refused to show up. He just retained his position and continued pushing new policies every single week, entirely unchecked by Congress.
We'll wrap up this explainer with the documentary's final, lingering question. How will the nation reckon with the lasting impact of Miller's policies on American democracy and its pluralistic society? The source argues that even if the architect eventually leaves the administration, he's fundamentally damaged the idea of the country as an open, welcoming society. So how does the system effectively move forward when such extreme domestic disruption manages to completely bypass traditional forms of accountability? It's something we absolutely have to consider as we look at the mechanics of power and modern government today. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.